All right, we heard from our correspondent in Bavaria in Germany earlier, Trent Murray, that the war in Ukraine and food prices dominating those G7 talks. He joins us again now. Trent, thank you for being with us. So the question is always asked, is this about building relationships, about talking, or do these G7 summits actually result in practical change for the world? Just tell us what has come out in terms of the overall communique and what has been agreed upon.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you always really get the devil in the detail once that communique is released. It is a 27-page document outlining what those G7 leaders have agreed. Launching it as those talks wrapped up was German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and he said it can be best understood by three key points. Number one, the G7 countries say they will continue to stand with Ukraine. They double down on their language, saying President Putin must not win this war. And so we do expect more military aid going to Ukraine, especially from the West. Number two was fighting famine around the world. And they came armed with their checkbook for that, pledging around 70 billion rand in fresh funding, particularly as concerns grow about food shortages in the wake of the war in Ukraine, given all of that grain that is stuck there, grain like corn, wheat and barley. And then the final one was making sure that the G7 doesn't forget about its long-term commitments, things like climate change and tackling global health. Of course, they're not getting the headlines right now because of what's happening in Ukraine, but they say we cannot forget about them, and so they are pledging to make sure that they will continue to walk towards those targets.
The language you mentioned around Ukraine, South Africa has never used that language, and we voted differently, or we've abstained from voting in the UN, so different to a lot of the G7 countries. You spoke about our President Ramaphosa's disinvolvement earlier, saying he was spoken to about Russia, but seen as something of a peace broker. Just remind us about South Africa's role and continue with that and how he's been involved in the most recent discussions.
Yeah, of course. I mean, South Africa was invited to join this summit as a special guest of German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. They came with a number of other countries, a small handful, India, Indonesia, Senegal, for example. But what I understand is from those meetings that there was some quite frank discussions on behalf of the South African delegation, particularly when it came to climate change. As we heard there, the President speaking just before I came on air, effectively what he conveyed was when it comes to targets and renewable energy, South Africa and the developing world is very open to it and agrees it's important, but the funding needs to be there because any sort of immediate phase out could have a serious interruption to people's lives, especially people that work in mining or the fossil fuel industry. And it was interesting because when I was listening to Chancellor Olaf Scholz today in his final press conference, he actually referenced those conversations with President Ramaphosa. He said, we've listened to what South Africa's had to say on this issue, and actually it's going to influence how we continue to roll out these types of programs to new countries that we want to work with, like India and Vietnam. So clearly that message was well received by the G7, and they understand that some of these issues are quite difficult, especially for the developing world. On the Russia question, it was brought up between the meeting with UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and President Ramaphosa, but President Ramaphosa, from what I understand, effectively reiterated South Africa's position, which is the country will continue to work with both Russia and Ukraine. They are partners economically, especially in the agriculture space. Of course, the main concern, once again, remains food security. A lot of that food does come from both Russia and Ukraine. So President Ramaphosa says that working relationship needs to remain. But he also said this whole war has been for him a real reminder of the fact that Africa as a whole needs to do more to make its own fertilizer and to make its own food, so it is not reliant on countries in Europe should interruptions like this happen, and then we have all the immediate consequences afterwards.
All right, as one summit ends, another begins. Tell us quickly what's next on the global calendar.
Yeah, that's right. Those G7 leaders will swap the mountains of Bavaria for the Spanish capital, Madrid, where they will entirely switch gears to talk one thing and one thing only, that is military, a special NATO summit taking place. Of course, the only topic once again in that room will be Russia. Much of you are very nervous about what's happening there. The main issue up for discussion is also this idea of increasing NATO's rapid reaction force from some 40,000 troops to 300,000 troops. It is an extraordinary increase, but I think it gives you some idea of just how some European countries are feeling right now, especially over fears about what President Putin may have planned next.
Yeah, sure. An incredible increase. Thank you very much, SABC News correspondent Trent Murray.